There are people in this world who believe they know everything. They have read all the books, earned all the degrees, and collected all the titles. They walk through life with their chins held high, convinced that their opinion is the only one that matters. And when they speak, they expect everyone to listen. Edmund Ashworth was exactly that kind of man. He was 62 years old, a professor of classical music at one of the most respected conservatories in London. His name carried weight in academic circles. Music critics quoted him in their reviews. Young composers feared his judgment, and students whispered about him in the hallways, warning each other not to make mistakes in his presence. Not Edmund had spent his entire life surrounded by music. He had studied in Vienna as a young man, trained under legendary teachers in Berlin, and performed in concert halls across Europe before deciding that teaching was his true calling. Or perhaps it was not teaching that called to him, but the power that came with it. The power to shape opinions. The power to decide who was talented and who was not. The power to be the final word on what was beautiful and what was worthless. He wore expensive suits. He spoke with a deep, commanding voice. And he never, ever admitted that he was wrong about anything. On a cold evening in late October, the conservatory held a gathering for its faculty members. It was an annual tradition, a chance for professors and visiting scholars to mingle over wine and conversation in the grand reception hall. The room was filled with the soft glow of chandeliers, the clink of glasses, and the quiet hum of intellectual discussion. Edmund stood near the fireplace, a glass of red wine in his hand, surrounded by a small group of colleagues who hung on his every word. He enjoyed these moments. He enjoyed being the center of attention, the one whose opinions shaped the conversation. The topic that evening had turned to composers. Someone mentioned Mozart. Another brought up Beethoven. And then a younger professor named Thomas, who had only joined the faculty the previous year, made a comment that would change everything. "I have been listening to Chopin lately," Thomas said, almost casually. "There is something about his nocturnes that moves me deeply. The emotional range, the way he makes the piano sing like a human voice. I think he might be one of the most expressive composers who ever lived." The group fell silent. All eyes turned to Edmund. He took a slow sip of his wine. Then he smiled, but it was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who was about to crush something beneath his heel. "Chopin," he said, pronouncing the name as if it left a bad taste in his mouth. "You are moved by Chopin?" Thomas shifted uncomfortably. Yes, I find his work quite beautiful." Edmund set his glass down on the mantelpiece with a soft click. He clasped his hands behind his back and looked at Thomas the way a teacher might look at a student who had just given a foolish answer. "Let me tell you something about Chopin," Edmund began, his voice carrying across the room. Other conversations stopped. People turned to listen. This was what always happened when Edmund spoke. The world seemed to pause and wait. "Chopin was a composer of drawing rooms," he continued. "His music was written for lovesick women and sentimental aristocrats who wanted something pretty to listen to while they sipped their tea. There is no intellectual rigor in his work, no structural complexity, no depth." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Compare him to Bach, who built cathedrals out of sound. Compare him to Beethoven, who wrestled with the heavens and won. What did Chopin do? He wrote pleasant little melodies for the piano. Technically adequate, I will grant you, but emotionally overwrought, shallow, forgettable." Thomas opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. What could he say? Edmund was the authority here. Edmund had the degrees, the experience, the reputation. Who was Thomas to argue? "If you want to understand true musical genius," Edmund concluded, "study the Germans. Study the Austrians. Leave Chopin to the amateurs and the romantics who do not know any better." A few people in the group nodded. Others looked down at their drinks, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. No one disagreed. No one ever disagreed with Edmund Ashworth. But there was someone in that room who heard every word. Someone who stood near the doorway, half hidden in the shadows, holding a glass of water. She had barely touched Dot. Her name was Zofia Kowalska. She was 26 years old, a visiting doctoral student from Warsaw. She had arrived in London just 3 weeks earlier on a modest scholarship to study historical performance practices. She had no money, no connections, and no reputation. She was nobody in this world of fancy titles and expensive suits, but she had something that Edmund Ashworth would never understand. She had a history. Zofia had grown up in a small apartment in Krakow, raised by her grandmother after her parents died in a car accident when she was only 4 years old. They had very little. The walls were thin. The winters were cold. There was never enough money for new clothes or proper lessons. But there was music. Her grandmother, a woman named Helena, had survived the Second World War. She never spoke much about those years. The memories were too painful, too heavy to put into words. But she had kept one thing from her past, one treasure that she protected like it was made of gold. An old record player. And a single vinyl record. The record was scratched and worn. It skipped in places. But when Helena played it, the room filled with the most beautiful sound Zofia had ever heard. It was Chopin, the Nocturnes, played by a Polish pianist whose name Zofia would not learn until many years later. That pianist had died in Auschwitz. Helena would sit beside the record player, her eyes closed, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. And little Zofia would sit beside her, not understanding why her grandmother was crying, but feeling somehow that this music was important, that it meant something, that it carried a weight too heavy for words. When Zofia was 7, Helena began teaching her to play piano on an old upright that a neighbor had given them. The keys were yellow. Some of them stuck. But Zofia practiced every day, hour after hour, because it made her grandmother smile. This music, Helena would say, her voice soft and trembling, is not just notes on a page. It is our history, our sorrow, our survival. Chopin understood what it meant to lose your home. He was exiled from Poland. He never returned. He poured all of that longing, all of that pain, into his music. When you play Chopin, you are not just playing notes. You are keeping a memory alive. Zofia never forgot those words. And now, standing in this elegant London room, surrounded by people who thought they knew everything about music, she had just heard a man call that sacred music sentimental noise. She had just heard him dismiss Chopin as shallow and forgettable. She had just heard him insult everything her grandmother had taught her to love. Her hands trembled. Her jaw tightened. She wanted to walk across the room and tell this arrogant man exactly what Chopin meant to her grandmother, to her country, to everyone who had ever suffered and found comfort in those notes. But she did not. She was nobody here. She had no power, no reputation, no voice that anyone would listen to. So she set her glass down quietly. She turned and walked out of the room without a word. No one noticed her leave. No one even knew she had been there. But Zofia Kowalska did not forget. She walked back to her tiny rented room that night, sat down on the edge of her narrow bed, and stared at the photograph she kept on her nightstand. It showed her grandmother as a young woman, standing beside another woman who was seated at a piano. Both of them were smiling. Both of them were wearing Stars of David pinned to their dresses. The woman at the piano was Helena's teacher. She had taught Helena to play before the war, before everything was taken away. She had died in the camps, but her music had survived. It had survived through Helena, and now it survived through Zofia. "I will not let him win," Zofia whispered to the photograph. "I will show him what Chopin really means." She did not know how. She did not know when. But she knew, with every fiber of her being, that the moment would come. And when it did, she would be ready. The days that followed were difficult for Zofia. She went to her classes. She sat in the library and read through old manuscripts. She smiled politely when other students greeted her. But inside, she was carrying a wound that would not heal. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard Edmund Ashworth's voice. That cold, dismissive tone. That arrogant laugh. The way he had said the word Chopin, as if it were something dirty. Something beneath him. Sentimental noise. The words echoed in her mind. Like a song she could not forget. She thought about calling her grandmother. Helena was 83 years old now, still living in that same small apartment in Krakow, still listening to that same scratched record on quiet evenings. Zofia wanted to hear her voice, to be reminded of why she had come all this way, to feel connected to something real in this cold and unfamiliar city. But she did not call. She could not bring herself to tell Helena what had happened. How could she explain that a man in London, a man with fancy degrees and a famous name, had called their music worthless? It would break her grandmother's heart. So Zofia kept the pain to herself. She buried it deep and tried to focus on her work, but the wound stayed open. 2 weeks passed. Autumn deepened into something colder, and the trees outside the conservatory dropped their leaves one by one. Zofia spent most of her time alone. She did not have many friends here. The other students were friendly enough, but they came from different worlds. They talked about holidays in Switzerland and summers in the south of France. They wore clothes that cost more than Zofia earned in a month. They did not understand what it meant to grow up with nothing, to learn music not from expensive teachers, but from a grandmother who had survived unspeakable things. Zofia did not blame them. They were not bad people. They simply did not know. How could they? One afternoon, she was walking through the main hallway of the conservatory when she noticed a small crowd gathered around the bulletin board. Students were pointing at something, whispering excitedly. Curious, Zofia moved closer. She stood on her toes and looked over someone's shoulder to see what all the fuss was about. It was a poster. Elegant gold lettering on a black background. The annual autumn showcase. Every year, the conservatory held a special evening where faculty members and visiting scholars could perform for an audience of donors, critics, and the city's cultural elite. It was a prestigious event, a chance to be seen and heard by people who mattered. Zofia had heard about the showcase, but she had never considered participating. She was a nobody, a visiting student from Poland with no reputation and no connections. Why would anyone want to hear her play? But as she read the poster, something stirred inside her. A small spark of something that had been sleeping for 2 weeks. The showcase was open to all faculty and visiting scholars. Anyone could sign up. Anyone could perform. She stared at the poster for a long time. The other students moved on, chattering about which pieces they might play, which professors they hoped to impress. But Zofia stood frozen, her mind racing. What if she signed up? What if she performed? The thought terrified her. She imagined walking onto that stage, sitting down at the piano in front of hundreds of strangers. She imagined Edmund Ashworth sitting in the front row, his arms crossed, that smug smile on his face. No, she could not do it. It was too risky, too frightening. She was not good enough. She turned away from the poster and walked quickly down the hallway, her heart pounding. But that night, lying in her small bed, staring at the ceiling, she could not stop thinking about it. She thought about her grandmother. She thought about all those evenings in the tiny apartment in Krakow, the two of them sitting beside the old record player, listening to Chopin as the world outside grew dark and quiet. She thought about Helena's hands, wrinkled and scarred, gently guiding her own small fingers across the piano keys. Music is not about being perfect, Helena had told her once. It is about being honest. It is about telling the truth with your heart, even when your voice is shaking. Zofia sat up in bed. She reached for the photograph on her knitstand, the one showing her grandmother and the woman at the piano. She held it in her hands and looked at those two smiling faces, frozen in a moment before the world fell apart. They had been brave. They had faced things that Zofia could not even imagine. And they had survived. Not because they were strong or special, but because they refused to let the darkness win. What was Zofia afraid of? A man with a loud voice and a cruel opinion? A room full of strangers who might judge her? She thought about Edmund Ashworth and his confident declarations. She thought about how no one had challenged him, how everyone had simply nodded along and accepted his words as truth. But his words were not truth. They were ignorance dressed up in fancy language. He did not understand Chopin. He had never felt the weight of that music, the sorrow and the longing and the hope that lived inside every note. Zofia understood. Her grandmother understood. And maybe, just maybe, it was time for someone to show Edmund Ashworth what he was missing. The next morning, Zofia walked into the conservatory with a new feeling in her chest. It was not quite courage. It was something quieter than that. A sense of purpose. A decision that had been made in the dark hours of the night and could not be undone. She found the sign-up sheet pinned to the bulletin board beside the poster. Several names were already written there, along with the pieces they planned to perform. She saw complicated titles, virtuosic showpieces designed to impress. Liszt, Rachmaninoff, Prokofiev. Zofia picked up the pen. Her hand trembled slightly, but she steadied herself. She wrote her name, Zofia Kowalska, and beside it, she wrote, Nocturne in C-sharp minor, Opus 27, Number 1 by Frédéric Chopin. She stared at the words for a moment. Then she set the pen down and walked away before she could change her mind. The next few weeks were the hardest of her life. She practiced every day, sometimes for 6 or 7 hours at a time. The conservatory had practice rooms that students could reserve, small soundproof spaces with pianos that were far better than anything Zofia had ever played at home. She played the Nocturne over and over again. She played it until her fingers ached, until her back was sore from sitting, until the notes were carved into her memory so deeply that she could hear them even when she was not playing. But it was not just about the notes. It was about something deeper than that. Zofia was not trying to play the piece perfectly. She was trying to find the truth inside it, the longing, the sorrow, the quiet, stubborn hope that refuses to die even in the darkest moments. She thought about Chopin himself, a young man forced to leave his homeland, never to return. She thought about the letters he wrote, filled with homesickness and grief. She thought about how he poured all of that pain into his music, transforming suffering into something beautiful. And she thought about her grandmother, about the war, about the people who had been lost and the music that had survived. Every time she played the Nocturne, she was not just playing notes. She was telling a story of exile and loss and the unbreakable human spirit. The day of the showcase arrived. Zofia woke before dawn, too nervous to sleep. She stood by her window and watched the sky slowly turn from black to gray to pale gold. The city was quiet. The streets were empty. She took the photograph of her grandmother from the knitstand and held it against her heart. "Give me strength," she whispered. "Help me do this. Help me make them understand." She dressed carefully in the only formal outfit she owned, a simple black dress that Helena had bought for her before she left for London. It was not expensive or fashionable, but it was elegant in its simplicity. She arrived at the conservatory early. The grand hall was already being prepared for the evening. with chairs arranged in neat rows and flowers placed on either side of the stage. The piano stood in the center, gleaming under the lights. Zofia stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at that piano. In a few hours, she would sit down at that bench. She would place her hands on those keys, and she would play the music that her grandmother had taught her to love. She did not know if anyone would understand. She did not know if her performance would change anything, but she knew that she had to try. She thought about Edmund Ashworth. She had seen his name in the program. He would be there tonight, sitting in the front row, waiting to judge everyone who dared to take that stage. Let him judge, Zofia thought. Let him sit there with his crossed arms and his cold smile. Tonight, she would not play for him. She would not play for the critics or the donors or the distinguished guests. She would play for her grandmother, for Helena's teacher, the woman who had died in the camps, for everyone who had ever been told that their music did not matter, that their stories were not worth hearing. She would play for Chopin himself, the exile who had never stopped longing for home. And maybe, just maybe, she would play for Edmund Ashworth too. Not to defeat him, but to teach him, to show him what he had been too blind and too proud to see. Zofia took a deep breath and stepped into the hall. Tonight, everything would change. The grand hall of the conservatory had never looked more beautiful. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting warm light across the polished wooden floors. Fresh flowers in tall glass vases lined the edges of the stage. Rows of velvet chairs stretched from the front of the room all the way to the back, and every single one of them was filled. This was the night that everyone had been waiting for. The annual autumn showcase was the most important event of the year, a chance for the conservatory to show off its finest talent to the people who mattered most. Donors in expensive suits sat beside music critics with notebooks in their laps. Distinguished professors mingled with wealthy patrons who had flown in from across Europe. The air was thick with perfume, cologne, and the quiet hum of anticipation. Backstage, Zofia stood alone in a corner, trying to control her breathing. She had never seen so many people in one place. Through a gap in the curtain, she could see the audience settling into their seats, chatting and laughing as if this were just another social gathering. To them, it probably was. A pleasant evening of music and wine and polite conversation. But to Zofia, it was everything. Her hands were cold. Her heart was beating so fast that she could feel it pulsing in her throat. She pressed her palms against the fabric of her simple black dress and tried to steady herself. You can do this, she told herself. You have practiced. You are ready. But another voice in her head, a smaller and crueler voice, whispered something different. Who are you to be here? You are nobody. A poor girl from Krakow with no reputation and no name. These people will not care about you. They will not understand. She closed her eyes and pushed the voice away. She could not afford to listen to it. Not tonight. The program for the evening was printed on elegant cream-colored paper. Zofia had picked one up earlier and studied it carefully. There were 12 performers scheduled, each one more impressive than the last. Professors with decades of experience. Visiting artists who had played in concert halls around the world. Students from wealthy families who had been trained by the best teachers money could buy. And then, near the end of the list, a name that did not belong, Zofia Kowalska. Nocturne in C-sharp minor by Frédéric Chopin. She had seen the way some of the other performers looked at her when they read that line. A few had smiled politely, but their eyes said something different. Chopin? At a showcase like this? Among all these virtuosic showpieces? One of the older students, a tall young man with slicked back hair, had actually laughed out loud. Chopin, he had said to his friend, not bothering to lower his voice. How charming. I suppose someone has to play the easy pieces. Zofia had pretended not to hear. She had walked past them with her head held high, refusing to let them see how much their words had stung. But now, standing alone backstage, the doubt was creeping back in. Maybe they were right. Maybe she did not belong here. Maybe she should just slip out the back door and disappear into the night before anyone noticed. She was so lost in her thoughts that she almost did not hear the announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the annual Autumn Showcase. The voice belonged to the conservatory's director, a distinguished woman with silver hair and a warm smile. She stood at the front of the stage, addressing the audience with the confidence of someone who had done this many times before. Sophia moved closer to the curtain and peered through the gap. She could see the audience now, their faces turned toward the stage. And there, in the very front row, sat a figure she recognized immediately. Edmund Ashworth. He was dressed in an impeccable dark suit with a burgundy tie. His silver hair was combed neatly back. His arms were crossed over his chest, and his expression was one of practiced boredom, as if he had already decided that nothing he heard tonight would impress him. Sophia's stomach tightened. She had known he would be here. She had prepared herself for this moment. But seeing him sitting there, so confident, so untouchable, made her knees feel weak. The showcase began. One by one, the performers took the stage. A professor played a thundering piece by Liszt, his fingers flying across the keys with dazzling speed. A visiting artist from Vienna performed a Rachmaninoff concerto arrangement that left the audience breathless. A young prodigy, barely 16 years old, played Prokofiev with a precision that seemed almost mechanical. The audience applauded after each performance. Some even rose to their feet. The critics scribbled notes in their books. The donors nodded approvingly. And through it all, Edmund Ashworth sat motionless in the front row. Occasionally, he would lean over and whisper something to the person beside him. Once or twice, Sophia saw him check his watch. He clapped politely after each piece, but his face never changed. He looked like a man who's waiting for the evening to end. Sophia watched from backstage, her anxiety growing with each passing minute. The performances were incredible. The level of skill on display was unlike anything she had ever seen. How could she possibly follow these masters? How could her simple nocturne compete with such brilliance? The program moved forward. One performer after another took the stage, played their piece, and received their applause. And with each passing moment, Sophia's turn drew closer. Finally, there was only one name left before hers. She watched as a young woman from the conservatory's doctoral program performed a fiendishly difficult piece by Chopin. The music was wild and chaotic, full of crashing chords and impossible runs. The audience leaned forward in their seats, captivated by the display of technical mastery. When it was over, the applause was thunderous. The young woman bowed deeply and walked off the stage, her face flushed with triumph. And then, the director's voice rang out once more. Our final performer of the evening is a visiting scholar from Warsaw. Please welcome Zofia Kowalska, performing Nocturne in C-sharp minor by Frédéric Chopin. Zofia felt the blood drain from her face. This was it. There was no turning back now. She took a deep breath. Then another. She thought of her grandmother, sitting alone in that small apartment in Krakow. She thought of Helena's hands, guiding her own across the piano keys. She thought of the scratched record spinning on the old player, filling the room with music that had survived war and death, and decades of silence. She stepped out onto the stage. The lights were blinding. For a moment, she could not see anything at all. Just brightness and warmth and the distant murmur of the audience. Then her eyes adjusted, and she saw them. Hundreds of faces, all turned toward her, watching, waiting. And in the front row, Edmund Ashworth uncrossed his arms and leaned forward slightly. She saw him glance down at his program, then back up at her. A small smile played at the corner of his lips. Not a kind smile, a knowing smile. The smile of a man who had already made up his mind. Sophia walked to the piano. Her footsteps echoed in the silence. The instrument was magnificent. A grand piano with a polished black surface that reflected the stage lights like a mirror. She had never played on anything so beautiful. For a moment, she just stood there, looking at it. Then she sat down on the bench. The audience was silent. The hall was still. Every eye was on her. Sophia placed her hands on her lap. She looked down at the keys, row after row of black and white, stretching out before her like a road leading somewhere unknown. She did not play. Not yet. Instead, she closed her eyes. She thought of Krakow. The small apartment with the thin walls. The cold winters and the warm summers. Her grandmother's voice, soft and trembling, telling her stories about the old days. She thought of Helena's teacher, the woman in the photograph, smiling at the camera with no idea of what was coming. She thought of the camps, the trains, the unspeakable things that had happened to so many people. And she thought of the music that had survived it all, passed down from hand to hand, heart to heart, generation to generation. She thought of Chopin himself, a young man saying goodbye to his homeland, carrying a jar of Polish soil that he would keep until the day he died. A man who never stopped longing for home, who poured all of that longing into music that would outlive him by centuries. The audience shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. The silence stretched on, growing heavier with each passing second. In the front row, Edmund Ashworth's smile began to fade. He frowned slightly, confused by the delay. But Sophia was not ready. Not yet. She was gathering something inside herself. Something that could not be rushed. Something that had been building for weeks, for years, for generations. She was gathering the weight of history, the sorrow of exile, the pain of loss, and beneath it all, the quiet, stubborn hope that refuses to die. When she finally opened her eyes, they were wet with tears she had not realized. She was holding. She raised her hands. She placed her fingers on the keys. And in the grand hall of the London Conservatory, surrounded by strangers who did not know her name, Zofia Kowalska began to play. The first note rose from the piano like a question whispered in the dark. It was soft, so soft that some people in the back rows leaned forward, straining to hear. There was no thunder, no flash of brilliance, no display of technical skill. Just a single sound, fragile and delicate, hanging in the air like a thread of light in an empty room. Then came the second note, and the third. And slowly, gently, the melody began to unfold. Sophia was not thinking about the audience anymore. She was not thinking about Edmund Ashworth or the critics or the wealthy donors in their expensive clothes. She was not even thinking about herself. She was somewhere else entirely. She was back in Krakow, sitting beside her grandmother in that small apartment with the thin walls. The old record player was spinning, and the room was filled with music. Helena's eyes were closed, and tears were streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. And little Zofia did not understand why her grandmother was crying, but she knew that this moment was sacred. She knew that this music carried something too heavy for words. That was where she played from now. Not from her fingers, not from her mind. From that place deep inside her chest, where memory and love and sorrow all lived together. Nocturne moved forward like a river flowing through the night. The melody rose and fell, breathing like a living thing. There were no sharp edges, no sudden movements. Everything was smooth and connected, each phrase leading naturally into the next. In the audience, something strange began to happen. People stopped shifting in their seats. The quiet coughs and rustles that had filled the hall during other performances disappeared completely. Even the critics, who had been scribbling notes throughout the evening, set their pens down and simply listened. The music was doing something to them. Something they had not expected. It was not impressive in the way the other performances had been impressive. There were no impossible runs, no thundering chords, no displays of virtuosity that made the audience gasp. And yet, somehow, this was different. This reached deeper. A woman in the third row felt tears prick at her eyes and did not know why. A man near the back found himself thinking about his mother, who had died 10 years ago. A young student clutched her program in her hands and felt her heart ache with a longing she could not name. The Nocturne was speaking to them, not in words, but in something older and more powerful than words. It was speaking to the part of them that remembered what it felt like to lose something precious, to miss someone who was gone, to stand at a window and watch the rain fall and feel, for no reason at all, unbearably sad. Sophia played on, her eyes half closed, her body swaying gently with the music. Her fingers moved across the keys with a tenderness that made every note feel like a confession. She was not performing anymore. She was praying. The melody reached a passage of particular beauty, a series of rising phrases that seemed to lift toward the ceiling like smoke from a candle. Each note was perfectly placed, perfectly weighted, carrying just enough sound and just enough silence. And then the music changed. The middle section of the Nocturne grew darker, more restless. The gentle melody gave way to something more agitated, more searching. The left hand played a pattern that rumbled beneath the surface like distant thunder, while the right hand spun out phrases that seemed to be asking a question over and over again, never finding an answer. This was the part of the piece that spoke of struggle, of exile, of the long nights when Chopin sat alone in his room in Paris, far from home, coughing blood into his handkerchief, knowing that he would never see Poland again. Sophia felt that struggle in her own body. She thought of her grandmother, young and frightened, watching her teacher being taken away by soldiers. She thought of the trains and the camps, and the smoke rising into the sky. She thought of all the people who had been lost, all the stories that had been silenced, all the music that had almost disappeared forever. Her fingers pressed harder into the keys. The sound grew more intense, more urgent. The audience held their breath, and then, just when the tension seemed unbearable, the storm began to pass. The music softened. The agitation faded. The gentle melody returned, but now it carried something new, a sense of peace, of acceptance, of sorrow that had been transformed into something beautiful. This was what Chopin understood better than anyone. That sadness does not have to destroy us, that pain can be turned into art, that even the deepest wounds can become doorways to something transcendent. Sophia felt tears running down her cheeks, but she did not stop playing. She could not stop. The music was pouring through her now, and she was just the vessel, the channel, the hands that gave it form. The final passage approached. The melody grew softer and softer, retreating into silence like a dream fading at the edge of morning. Each note was more delicate than the last, more fragile, more precious. In the front row, something extraordinary was happening. Edmund Ashworth had not moved since the first note. His arms, which had been crossed at the beginning, now hung loose at his sides. His face, which had worn that smug and knowing smile, was completely still. His eyes, which had been so cold and dismissive, were fixed on the young woman at the piano with an expression that no one in the hall had ever seen before. He was listening, truly listening. For the first time in longer than he could remember, the music had broken through something inside him. Some wall he had built years ago, some armor he had worn so long that he had forgotten it was there. And behind that wall, behind that armor, there was a part of him that he had tried very hard to forget, a part that remembered what it felt like to be young and full of hope, a part that remembered sitting at a piano for the first time, touching the keys with trembling fingers, feeling the magic of making sound out of silence, a part that had once believed that music was not about technique or intellect or reputation, but about something deeper. Something sacred. He had buried that part of himself long ago. He had decided that it was foolish, sentimental, weak. He had wrapped himself in knowledge and credentials, and the cold comfort of being right about everything. But now, listening to this young woman from Warsaw play a piece he had dismissed as worthless, he felt that buried part of himself stirring, rising, breaking through the surface, like a flower pushing through frozen ground. His eyes were wet. He did not wipe them. He did not care who saw. Zofia played the final notes of the Nocturne. The melody descended gently, step by step, until it reached the last chord. A simple chord, nothing complicated, nothing flashy. Just a sound that said, "This is the end. This is goodbye. This is peace." She held the chord for a long moment, letting it ring through the hall. Then she lifted her fingers from the keys. Silence. Complete. Absolute silence. No one moved. No one breathed. The hall was frozen, suspended in a moment that seemed to exist outside of time. Zofia sat at the piano with her hands in her lap, her head bowed, tears still wet on her cheeks. She did not know if she had succeeded or failed. She did not know if anyone had understood. She only knew that she had given everything she had. She had played with her whole heart, holding nothing back. The silence stretched on. 1 second. 2. 3. It was the longest silence Zofia had ever experienced. It pressed against her from all sides, heavy and suffocating. She began to wonder if she had made a terrible mistake. Maybe they had not felt anything. Maybe they were sitting there in embarrassed silence, waiting for her to leave the stage so they could forget about her. Then, from somewhere in the back of the hall, a single pair of hands began to clap. Another joined. Then another. And another. The applause spread through the audience like a wave, growing louder and stronger with each passing second. People rose from their seats, one by one, then in groups, then all at once. The hall filled with the thunder of clapping hands, and beneath that thunder, something else. Something softer. Crying. People were crying. Openly, unashamedly, wiping their eyes and clapping at the same time. Zofia looked up, blinking through her tears, and saw something she would never forget. The entire audience was on their feet. Every single person. The donors, the critics, the professors, the students. All of them standing, all of them applauding, all of them looking at her with something in their eyes that she had never seen directed at her before. Respect, gratitude, awe, and in the front row, standing with the rest, was Edmund Ashworth. His hands were pressed together in front of his chest. His face was wet with tears he had not bothered to hide. And his eyes, those cold and arrogant eyes, were fixed on Zofia with an expression she could not quite name. It was not defeat. It was not anger. It was not even surprise. It was wonder. The applause went on and on. Zofia did not know how long she sat there, overwhelmed by the sound, by the faces, by the impossible reality of what was happening. It felt like a dream. It felt like a miracle. Finally, slowly, she rose from the bench. She turned to face the audience, and for the first time that evening, she allowed herself to smile. A small smile. A humble smile. The smile of someone who had given everything and found, against all odds, that it was enough. She bowed once, deeply, and walked off the stage. Behind her. The applause continued to thunder through the hall, but Zofia barely heard it. She was thinking about her grandmother, about Helena's teacher, about all the people who had carried this music through darkness and death, and decades of silence. She had done it. She had made them. Backstage, the world felt strangely quiet. Zofia stood in the corner where she had waited before her performance, but everything was different now. The fear was gone. The doubt was gone. In their place was a feeling she could not quite name. Something between exhaustion and peace. Something like coming home after a very long journey. She could still hear the applause echoing through the walls, but it sounded distant now, like thunder from a storm that had already passed. People were moving around her, other performers and staff members, but she barely noticed them. She was lost in her own thoughts, replaying the last few minutes in her mind, still not quite believing what had happened. She had done it. She had walked onto that stage, sat down at that piano, and played with her whole heart. And somehow, against all odds, people had understood. Her grandmother would have been proud. Sophia reached into the small bag she had brought with her and pulled out the photograph. The two women smiled up at her from across the decades, frozen in a moment of happiness before the world fell apart. She traced her finger gently across their faces. "I did it," she whispered. "I hope you heard it, wherever you are." She was so absorbed in the photograph that she did not notice the footsteps approaching. She did not see the tall figure in the dark suit until he was standing just a few feet away, watching her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Edmund Ashworth. Sophia looked up, startled. For a moment, they just stared at each other. The arrogant professor who had dismissed Chopin as sentimental noise. The young woman from Warsaw who had just proven him wrong in front of everyone, who mattered dot. She expected him to say something dismissive, something cutting. Perhaps he would find some flaw in her performance to criticize, some technical mistake to point out. Men like him always found ways to protect their pride, but Edmund did not speak. Not right away. He stood there in the dim light of the backstage area, and Sophia saw something she had never expected to see. His eyes were red. His face was tired. He looked like a man who had just been through something difficult, something that had shaken him to his core dot. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. "Miss Kowalska." Sophia straightened her back. She would not be intimidated. Not anymore. Not after what she had just done. "Professor Ashworth," she replied, her voice steady. He opened his mouth, and she prepared herself for whatever criticism was coming. But the words that came out were not what she expected at all. "I was wrong." Sophia blinked. She was not sure she had heard him correctly. "I'm sorry?" She said. Edmund took a deep breath. He looked like a man who was not used to saying these words, a man for whom admitting a mistake was harder than climbing a mountain. "I was wrong," he repeated. "About Chopin. About everything I said that night at the faculty gathering. I was arrogant and foolish, and I did not know what I was talking about." Sophia stared at him. Of all the things she had imagined might happen tonight, this was not one of them. Edmund Ashworth, the great authority, the man whose opinion could make or break careers, was standing in front of her and apologizing. "I have spent my entire career studying music," he continued, his voice quiet. "I have read every book, analyzed every score, memorized every theory. I thought I understood what music was. I thought it was about structure and technique and intellectual rigor." He paused, shaking his head slowly. "But tonight, listening to you play, I realized that I have missed the point entirely. I have spent so many years in my head that I forgot to listen with my heart. I forgot what music is really for." Sophia did not know what to say. She had prepared herself for battle, not for surrender. "What you did out there," Edmund said, gesturing toward the stage, "was not just a performance. It was something else. Something I have not heard in a very long time. You were not trying to impress anyone. You were not showing off your skills. You were telling the truth." He looked at her with something that might have been admiration. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Sophia was quiet for a moment. Then she held up the photograph so he could see it. "My grandmother," she said softly. "She taught me." Edmund looked at the photograph. Two women, young and smiling, one seated at a piano. Stars of David pinned to their dresses. His face changed. The arrogance, the pride, the coldness that he had worn like armor for so many years, all of it seemed to fall away. What remained was something raw, something human. The woman at the piano, Zofia continued. She was my grandmother's teacher. She taught her to play before the war, when they were both young and the world was still full of possibilities. Her name was Roka. She was kind and patient, and she loved music more than anything. Zofia's voice trembled slightly, but she kept going. She did not survive. She was taken to Auschwitz. She died there, like so many others. But before she was taken, she gave my grandmother a gift. She taught her Chopin. She taught her that music can carry memories, that it can preserve what would otherwise be lost. Edmund was very still. He did not interrupt. My grandmother kept that gift alive through everything that followed. The war, the occupation, the years of poverty and struggle. She passed it on to me, just as Roka had passed it on to her. And tonight, when I sat down at that piano, I was not playing alone. I was playing with all of them. With Roka, with my grandmother, with everyone who ever loved this music and refused to let it die. She looked Edmund directly in the eyes. That is what you called sentimental noise. Professor, memory, survival, love, the things that cannot be measured or analyzed, but that matter more than anything else. Edmund was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I am deeply sorry. I did not know. No, Zofia agreed. You did not. She could have left it there. She could have accepted his apology and walked away, satisfied that she had proven her point. But something stopped her. Looking at this man, this proud and difficult man who had just admitted he was wrong, she saw something she had not expected to see. She saw someone who was lost, someone who had spent so many years building walls around himself that he had forgotten what it felt like to be moved by beauty. Someone who had traded wonder for certainty and had only just realized what a terrible bargain that was. He was not her enemy. He was just a man who had made a mistake. A man who was finally ready to learn. Zofia took a deep breath. You asked me where I learned to play like that, she said. The truth is, you cannot learn it from books or teachers. You can only learn it by listening. Really listening. Not with your mind, but with your heart. She held out the photograph to him. Chopin understood this. He was exiled from Poland when he was 20 years old. He carried a jar of Polish soil with him wherever he went. He never stopped longing for home. And he poured all of that longing, all of that love into his music. Edmund took the photograph gently, as if it were something precious. He looked at the two smiling women for a long moment. I have wasted so many years, he said quietly. So many years of not understanding. Zofia reached out and took the photograph back. She tucked it carefully into her bag. It is not too late, she said. It is never too late to learn how to listen. Edmund looked at her. For a moment, he seemed like he wanted to say something more, but the words would not come. Instead, he simply extended his hand. Zofia looked at it. This hand that had conducted orchestras, that had written scathing reviews, that had shaped the opinions of an entire generation of musicians. Now it was being offered to her in a gesture of respect, of humility, of hope. That she took it. Thank you, Edmund said, for teaching me something tonight, something I should have learned a long time ago. Zofia shook his hand firmly. Thank you, she replied, for being willing to listen. They stood there for a moment, two people from different worlds, connected by something neither of them fully understood. Then Edmund released her hand, nodded once, and turned to walk away. But after a few steps, he stopped. He looked back at her over his shoulder. Miss Kowalska, he said, If you ever need anything, a recommendation, a reference, someone to speak on your behalf, please do not hesitate to ask. It would be my honor. Zofia smiled. A real smile. A warm smile. I will remember that, Professor. He nodded again and walked away into the shadows. Zofia stood alone in the quiet backstage area, holding her bag with the photograph inside. The sounds of the reception had started in the main hall. The clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversation, the polite laughter of people who had just witnessed something extraordinary. But Zofia did not feel like celebrating. She felt like calling her grandmother. She pulled out her phone and dialed the number she knew by heart. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Then a familiar voice answered, old and warm and full of love. Zofia? Is that you? Yes, grandmother. It's me. How did it go? Tell me everything. Zofia leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she was smiling. It went well, she said. Better than I ever imagined. I played the Nocturne, the one you taught me. And grandmother, they understood. They really understood. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then a soft sound, halfway between a laugh and a sob. I knew you would make them understand, Helena said. I always knew. Zofia wiped her eyes and looked up at the ceiling. I wish you could have been here. I was there, her grandmother replied. I am always with you, my darling. Every time you sit down at the piano, Zo.